Welcome to Conversations from the Heart, honoring Andrew Cohen through our stories. My name is Daniela Bomater. I was a student of Andrew's for 17 years, and for the past 9 years, I had the privilege of living and working alongside him. This series is a tribute to his life, his teaching, and the evolutionary fire he sparked in so many of us. Through these intimate conversations, we remember not only the man, but the depths of transformation he catalyzed in our lives. May these stories keep his legacy alive, honoring the sacred thread that connects us and allowing his voice to continue resonating through ours. So welcome, Faheem, to this Conversations from the Heart. And while we were sitting quietly for a few minutes before I started the recording, I just realized that it's exactly 4 weeks since Andrew's passing. And I'm not even sure if I would say only 4 weeks or already 4 weeks. It's still so unreal in a way. And I'm very happy to have these conversations with many different people who have known Andrew and had their experiences with him and can tell stories. And I'm very much looking forward to have this conversation with you. And the way I like to start is just to ask you, how did you meet Andrew, and what happened then? How did you get inspired by him, or kind of gave a lot of years of your life to the time with him and his sangha, no?
How did I meet him? Well, it's one of those things with I just want to say I was reflecting on of course this to do this video recording, and I was very aware that it's one of those things I never thought I'd be doing. So, and I already felt a bit, I wanted to represent something about what it all meant, but I don't really have a conclusion. So I was just aware that it's a strange thing to be doing this. I have to say personally, and it's an important thing to do, I feel. So hopefully I'll do justice to something. But how I met Andrew, I was 18, or just coming up shy of 19 actually, and one of my dearest and oldest friends, he had actually, he was a bit more, he was older than me, he is older than me rather, and he'd come across Andrew, and he'd been on some kibbutz, and he was doing some different kinds of explorations, and we were reading Sartre, and so there was, in your late teens, there's all that exploration going on for some people, and we were in that sort of, inquiring and thing. And then I met my friend, and I think I just started university or was going to university or something like that. And he just was very light. There was something lit up about how he was, and it wasn't anything I could really put my finger on. And he just said, "Oh, I've met this person that I think you'd be interested in finding out what they've got to say." And he very lightly just kind of said, come if you're free, and see what you make of it. And that was kind of it. Nothing, no more context. At that time I was reading Krishnamurti to some degree and a few other things like that. So, I think this happened before. Yeah. Anyway, so then I came across, I think there was a teaching happening in London, where I live in London, and it was in I don't know, Euston or somewhere, Quakers Meeting House or something like that. And I walked into the scene. So my background is I grew up as a Muslim and quite a conservative, not a orthodox, but quite, just run-of-the-mill conservative family.
Mm-hmm.
Not really a particularly interested in anything, um, even though we were doing some readings, but that was just part of the kind of like the scene, as it were, that we're into.
Yeah.
But not really looking for any particular spiritual path teacher. Didn't even know what the concept of teacher was or path as well. We all know
Mm-hmm.
Rumi and those kinds of things, but that was kind of where we were at. And I went along and, about 200 people sitting in there on, little cushions, which was a new thing for me. And then and then it gets very quiet and there's a lot of intensity and a focus and all of those things. And I'm 18, and it's predominant.
What year was that for him?
I was
Just to put
19,
it
I think
in
I
the
was,
context of Andrew's
okay, so
overall teaching.
so it was 5 years after Andy started teaching. So it was
Okay,
91.
91. Huh?
91, yeah, the summer of
Yeah,
91, I believe.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. So then it was just a very wild experience because I didn't really know what was going on. I was sitting
Mm-hmm.
there and the two things happened, I guess. One was, even though I couldn't understand conceptually what he was talking about, what he was responding to, and all these different people and the questions. It was like an open form Q&A sort of thing, not necessarily how some of the later days there'd be, very long dialogues and, you know, topic-based discussions, that kind of thing. So this was
Mm-hmm.
pretty free form, old school, what now I understood to be satsangs,
Yeah.
and yeah, so there was all of this stuff going on, and but I could feel that he was very sincere and there was this ring of kind of vibration about what was going on in the room. I just felt like this is really, there's something going on here, which is very powerful was one thing, but really true, whatever that word meant, it just had this ring about all of it. And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of made deep sense to me, even though it sounds very counterintuitive. You don't really have a framework to understand this stuff, and yet something profoundly makes sense. So that was really my first, and I'm sitting like two-thirds of the way back, and all the people are very nice and, very, I have to say, middle class, upper class, very
Mm.
monoculture.
Monochrome.
There was not much diversity going on in that room from what I remember. So there's me, um, kind of connecting with this guy in this waistcoat sitting on this podium, and just it wasn't really Andrew at that moment. It was just what was going on for me that really
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't really relate to him as anything. I just had no frame of reference, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there was something I felt, whatever's going on, there's something really, important here. That was, if I'm honest, that's what came away. Then 2 or 3 days later, I was staying with my friend, and I remember just waking up in the middle or going to bed and having a very profound, it's like right now, it's like 30 plus 35 years later, and it's like it happened yesterday. This very clear seeing of, the only way I can put it is non-duality,
Mm-hmm.
where the relative and the absolute perfectly are one thing. And it was a very strange thing. It was seeing that there was no difference between what was on the outside of the window I was looking at and what was on the inside of the window I was looking at. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds absurdly simple, but it somehow really resonated with me, and it was a very powerful seeing of something, So that was, that happened, and I still remember it. It was just this moment where there's before that moment and after that moment, and and then as like as I've learned lots of things, some people in Zen Buddhism and something, they call it the base, and where there's actual recognition of something. So that happened within days of meeting him for the first time, and I didn't really speak to him. I mean, I may have asked a question, and I think he pretty much said, "Why are you asking that question?" or something. And and I'm like this 18-year-old, pretty shy character, and and I didn't really, I thought I should probably ask something, but I don't really, and I don't, it was probably a mixture of naivety and just literally not having a framework of questions. But I didn't
Mm-hmm.
have any
Mm-hmm.
questions because there was
Mm-hmm.
something direct going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I met him, completely not expecting it, and it's something really struck a chord.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then how did it continue? Did you get closer quickly, or did you follow him for a while, or what is
Uh,
happening then?
yeah, 91. So then I was studying at uni, and some very beautiful people around, Andrew, at the time, and and there was a whole bunch of other young men, as it were, floating around at that time. Well, actually, one or two, and we connected a little bit, but and
Hmm.
became very intimate very quickly in the sense of just it wasn't a personal kind of you're my best friend. It was just like we were in something together. So you, as young people, whether it's men or women, I don't know, but it was just like, oh, I can trust this friend of mine that I've discovered, or a couple of friends that you could just meet and be interested together. That was really what it
Hmm.
was for
Hmm.
me. But I went back up to uni. I was studying in the north of the UK, and at that time there was, and it has to be said, there was so Andrew had been teaching since 1986. So this was 5 or 6 years in, right? So five
Yeah.
years in. And so it was the beginning of sort of what I now look back and go phase two of and some of Andrew's work.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't really speak to the phase one, but they were kind of mythical people that we'd hear about. And I got to meet some of them and all the rest of it. And there genuinely, there was something lit up about people. That was really
Hmm.
it was just a very nice sort of like in the context of the UK back then, it's the 90s. It was just all about materialism, and we were all getting over our kind of angst of the Cold War ending and all of this stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd been to Germany a few years earlier when the wall came down. So there was a time where things were kind of, on the one hand, things were changing, but on the other hand, it was very material. So it was just like, okay, yeah, not really anything like this going on, I felt, that I could relate to this. So this was happening in its own other sphere. So at that time, so they would have these things where it wasn't really there was a community of sorts, and there was people that were quite, formally engaged with Andrew's students. I didn't do that. And I'll tell you why in a second, but um, I would travel down, and this is just one of those moments of the power of that really got me. Yeah, there was something happening. That's all I can say is that they have these discussion groups. So what a discussion group was, there'd be a book or a teaching or a little excerpt. I mean, sometimes a paragraph of about,
Hmm.
10
Hmm.
sentences. And they would gather once a week in Primrose Hill and have these things called discussion groups, which is really to understand some of the work that Andrew was doing, some of his quotes, some of his
Hmm.
teachings. And so, but though it wasn't really about, for me, there was something so magical about a bunch of people honestly because I was studying at university, right? And there was no
Hmm.
real passion about anything, really. You were just doing the
Hmm.
thing. You were kind of like going through the course of, you know, getting through your degree. And there was nothing, it wasn't that interesting actually compared to this. So we were sitting there and we'd come down. So I would get on a bus at, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, arrive in London, because I was a student and didn't have much money. I'd arrive in London in probably a very salubrious area, Primrose Hill, walk into a very nice house that they'd hired or rented, and we'd do 2 hours of very intense discussion around
Hmm.
aspect of what it meant to, different topics would come up based on whatever was, the quote, as there were. But we
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
really go into it. But for 2 hours, so you can imagine like 5 or 6 people in a very earnest way trying to understand something and have a direct, like Christian Murray said, direct experience of something,
Yeah.
of the meaning of it. And it was very powerful. And I still remember those things as being really formative in my kind of appreciation of why I would be even interested in this, because it was just inherently really interesting. And there wasn't really much kind of direction from Andrew, apart from let's just learn about some of these, um, you know, what later became teachings, but these things that so that, and then I'd
Yeah.
go back at 2 in the morning, back up to the north.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So, and that would be I literally spent a year doing this because, and I remember, my recollection of those early years at my university was basically that's what was happening. The university degree
Hmm.
was going on, but this was actually the most exciting thing. So everything kind of was there was kind of like a dual life I was living because no one else I knew could relate to anything that I was doing. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious about something, Fahim, that when you were talking about these discussion groups, because this is before the so-called intersubjective breakthrough
oh yeah,
in
wait,
two.
this was 1991. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. No, I understand that. But the way you are describing it, and you had later experiences with the intersubjective work too, no?
Oh.
What was it already going in that direction that people came together kind of because the way you describe it so beautifully, it sounds like people already shared a space of
Yeah, no, of course it was. It was probably some form of that. I think you have at the time. I think there was a real energetic freshness to so many aspects of
Mhm.
what was happening around and even with Andrew. I think from all I can understand of the time, um, so people were having very we were all lifted into something, of course, but it was a focus. So, as I've later learned in many years, there's many different forms of meditation. There's different practices that you do for different states of mind. All of these things,
Yeah, yeah.
in that sense, it was all about focus. Okay, so and really training the mind to discern. It was all about trying to figure out how to um, really be in a conversation about something
Mhm.
and do your utmost to not bring a lot of preconceptions to the moment and all of this. So really important training actually, which is valuable in any walk of life, but
Yeah, 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 exactly.
really focused. And yeah, so whether it was similar in some sense because it really it's had such a profound impact on me anyway.
Hmm.
Because you just realize things can become alive in the moment. That was the thing.
Hmm.
Life
Hmm.
can really be pregnant with something very, out of grasp, but very significant. You can really experience that in life, which is quite a good thing to know about, that kind of thing exists. So, yeah. So what else did you say?
No, no, I just I pick up from your description of what was happening there that it feels to me, it sounds to me that this was a precursor to the later intersubjective non-duality work that
Oh,
was
yeah, right.
consciously practiced then, because all the
Possibly.
qualities that you are describing are the qualities that one would describe in an intersubjective dialogue.
Well, yeah, I actually I think that's true. But also another thing at the time, there was this particular, and it's a great one to remember because we are talking about the impact that Andrew had in some of his work, and then obviously the community, and then there's also his kind of interpretation of the Dharma as well. So there's that triple jewel, the gem aspect. But
Yeah,
I think at that time, Andrew was very much exploring this whole concept of, he'd seen, he's written about it all as well. He'd saw that, and this did kind of come to pass in some ways, and it's still unfolding, I think. But that what was happening between different people around him was actually probably more significant than what happened between him and what he gave to people. And I think there was this amazing, well, I don't know, amazing. It was just kind of one of those ones with this like a depth charge of a teaching where you feel that. Because the way Andrew taught, and I think this is something that I've heard, which is a kind of like a hallmark of someone that's got access to, for want of a better word, enlightened awareness and perspective, is, spontaneously being able to, um, you know, have access to some kind of source of wisdom, which is
yeah,
very dynamic. But he himself, there's this one particular teaching, and he was called out of the swamp. And some
yeah,
people will remember this, but it was just this moment where he was kind of reaching into the furthest kind of, his conceptually kind of like breaking new ground. And
yeah.
I don't know whether he did or didn't. The jury's out on so many things. We can't really answer what it all means yet. but I do think that in that kind of posture that he had in those days was really quite meaningful because it felt like um, there was something being discovered. Whether it was brand new and a contribution to the great you know discourse of Dharma, we'll find out. But I think it was in his own experience and our own experience something that really felt you were reaching for. So that was
Yeah.
happening at the same time as these discussions. So there was just like, so I guess it was, maybe, and that whole particular thing that he was seeing was, well, whatever happens between people
Yeah.
is very much more significant than just the awakening or the liberation of an individual. That was kind of like where it all was the fulcrum point, because I think before
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
had been a different kind of emphasis. And I think because um, there was probably a rawness to what was going on. People were just like, and this was one thing I was thinking about because a lot of the people that I came into contact with, there's maybe about 50 people that were kind of around the scene, or maybe, in London at that time, maybe,
Hmm.
I can't remember. But a lot of those folks had been around for many years on the spiritual quote unquote path and serious,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, really beautiful individuals. And that to me, there was a lightness about just being around those kinds of characters, but also, later years, people talked about, and I've questioned a lot of, about our journey and everything, but what was it that for them? Because I knew for me, it was like it was going from no context to suddenly having some very profound experience out of the blue. So for me, it was the contrast was enormous.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
was like, something is happening here, and something's happened in relationship to what Andrew's doing and with the people around him. So it's very obvious to me that it was something really, to be explored and really followed, and it wasn't necessarily I wanted to follow a teacher. It really, it really wasn't that.
Hmm.
It happened, and then you're like, well, why I'd be foolish not to follow this, because this is what's
Yeah. Yeah.
bringing some life into my, up until then pretty conservative upbringing, So
Yeah.
and those people, those people definitely have said, that something stopped, the searching stopped when they met him.
Yeah.
So I think that for me that, was quite significant because for me it began and for other people it
Hmm.
stopped. So, I think so many people have different experiences of that moment or those meetings.
Oh, that's interesting because I think that was something that Andrew always felt was very important to see that at one point we have to acknowledge that the search stops, and then we can actually become an expression of what we have found, and we can identify it as a finder and bring that into the world. We kind of start to not focus on ourselves but look outward into what can we bring into the world now with this knowledge about the reality of existence, or and also with this purpose to bring this to more people or to bring this into the world. For
Yeah,
me, this was always one of the most important parts of Andrew's teaching, that in the end it's never for yourself, it's for the sake of the whole, it's for
right.
bringing the light into the world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I've I've basically known Andrew all my life, so my adult life. So I definitely, I think that's true reflection of Andrew. He really was, to a fault, I guess, even, you might say that was what he drove him. And um, um, and in that kind of focus also was had its impact on many areas of
Mm-hmm.
himself and his life and those of us around him in some ways, right? In many ways. And, that's a whole other discussion as well. But I think what I would say is that this whole thing of bringing the light, in the end, I mean, I kind of go back to basics with a lot of my life around Andrew. I really do, because in the end, if you those early days moments was, if you see, it was all about what they used to call discrimination and seeing clearly, which is just it's a thing in all traditions.
Hmm.
Um, but there was a particular way in which, um, how do I put it? I felt that is what was it was all about the inquiry, a living
Yeah,
inquiry, me, I think. And out of that, of course, there's going to be the outcome of that, and you can't, there's the outcome of that and the impact that having a different perspective has on you as a. And I really feel that when Andrew would talk about those things, and this is just how I've internalized it over the years. It isn't because I've become much more aware of how the mind will take, and this is classic student teacher stuff, right? The teacher in, all these, myriad ways will say something, and the student will take it a completely different way until they realize
yeah,
it's been said in the first place and it wasn't what they thought they were said. And that's the whole teaching.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's ongoing. And the classic stories that kind of inspire kids and adults through the ages are all about that. So it's not a bang, you meet a teacher and everything becomes clear. It actually gets more and more confusing.
No, no, no,
So
not at
suddenly
all.
deal
Exactly.
with this kind of reality of your own mind, of what is and decipher all of this stuff. And after I met him, I took 5 years before I even considered becoming formally involved with Andrew as a teacher, even
Mm,
though this profound thing had already happened.
yeah,
I felt like I needed to finish my studies, and I felt I needed to kind of just find out what this was all about first. And I was reading books by, Irene Tweedy, The Chasm of Fire, and stuff like that, which basically spelled out this kind of ordeal that you were going to, enter into if you were going to
yeah,
engage with some kind of, even if, and Andrew was known at that time for being pretty ferocious. I remember thinking about that and going, well, I guess so. I can see it, but I never really experienced that firsthand with him. I mean, in later years, Andrew was, I actually knew him as a person, and he knew me, right? But in those early years, I didn't really have any. There wasn't really much
yeah, yeah,
in me that was really. I needed to quite, maybe a blank slate to some degree, but and naively so, right? So that it was just like, or more about the excitement, and not even excitement. A lot of it was just trying to figure out what was going on.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I really remember those days as being lit up by something, but going, what is going on? It's just so
Yeah,
different.
that's interesting. Yeah.
So it took me 5 years. That's the thing, and I think that for me, I really, really was like trying to observe myself, looking at what it was that I'd be getting into, what I'd be giving up, what I'd be losing connection to, because where in the family that I grew up in, this was really a no-no. If you leave, I never really felt I left something, but I entered into a different kind of spiritual path.
Hmm.
So that's a big deal, right? And you
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
basically say you're likely to, you know, um, have a lot of downstream effects of that kind of decision. So in many ways, I didn't do a lot of things that maybe younger, men in their 20s were up to. I did my fair share of things, but I'm just saying there was a certain kind of renunciation, and then that extended to maybe how you thought about your career, how you thought about your
Mm,
family. So all of those things I was considering for 5 years. For me,
hmm.
it was like, well, do I really want to do anything like this? Get involved with a teacher, because I felt that it meant the renunciate path.
Yeah, yeah. And Andrew wouldn't have contradicted you. He would have said, yeah, that's what it means, because in his teaching it was always about putting spirit first and putting spirituality first, and everything else came second and third. So there were a lot of good reasons to think long about how closely you want to be engaged with him, no?
Yeah, and
And
I remember one boat trip we had this we'd celebrate this day, the Guru Purnima day with him, and it was this beautiful. We were on the River Dart, and we, remember. It's like one of those moments where you just like look back and go, what were you doing? But I remember I had some burning question I suddenly had come up with, right?
Hmm.
And I remember going up to him and saying, Andrew, and he looked at me and he said, look, I'm on holiday today. And it was just these moments where you just felt like, the overzealousness and seriousness that which we kind of took ourselves in some ways. He wasn't tuned into that whole thing. And this is just something that I my reflection about Andrew is like I really feel Andrew was he profoundly was one of another word, a mystic. He really did live and breathe in this other dimension. I mean, because of course he spoke of teachings and we created structures around him, and there was some real, over time, that they needed to be changed and all of those things, right? For sure. And people had to deal with the consequences of us, getting things wrong, and him, including him. But I think he really lived in another,
Hmm.
dimension and saw things, and obviously acted in this world, um, and even perhaps got too entangled in wanting his teaching to grow and really have this huge effect that he really felt the importance of it was, but at the same time he really was rooted in this other place, and that is the thing about
Hmm.
Andrew. He really is a mystic, um, because all sorts of manner of, and I'm not talking about kind of like superstitious things would happen, but very profound things would just have this kind of ongoing, they would happen around Andrew, and people
Yeah,
would
yeah.
again and again. And we're just talking about simple things like suddenly some recognition of something, or someone, for me, his understanding of, my background and who I was, and the things that I needed to, consider to kind of like really progress, unquote unquote, and develop as a human being. He kind of like pointed those things out in sometimes very subtle
Hmm.
ways in which it took years to actually really get. And I think this is the other side of Andrew that I think seems to, it's easy for it to be missed because I obviously lived that life for so many years. So it was just but it's a story that gets missed sometimes, is how much Andrew had a lot of impatience around certain things, but he had enormous, endless
Yes.
patience in other
Yeah.
dimensions. And I think that's something that is really quite profound because, you know, I often think about this because my career, my professional careers, I've been around leaders and CEOs and all of this wonderful stuff, and you see a lot of what happens around leaders,
Hmm.
and how things can occur. So I think with Andrew, he really had a patience, which I think comes from some other a connection to something to deal with the complexity of the human condition. I mean, and by the end of his life, of course, I think it kind of came full circles where he understood the complexity of his own condition much more as well. But he really had this ability because there were so many of us that he was dealing with, and there was enormous patience in that. And I don't know, it's just something that I realized isn't, I never hear people talk about, so I wanted to say that about him because,
Hmm.
and he really, at times would just exercise enormous, just there was a lot of grace coming out of him in many ways, which is very, unless you're kind of dealing with your own humanity in relationship to a teacher, that's enormous in the first place for anyone to do that, right? And then you have a teacher that actually, and he'd often say this, I take you far more seriously than yourself,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
thought, and
And I
it
think
took,
that's what's true.
well, I think, yeah, I mean, again, to a fault at times, but it was like, and then but I would say for the first 10 years of knowing him, it was all about learning, what is this thing for me? What is going on?
Hmm.
What is all of this? And then after that, and then there was a few years of real intense inquiry, and really being asked to kind of be true to what you had experienced. And
Yeah,
Andrew did have that
exactly.
quality about him. And if you didn't really want to do that, I think in the end it was yourself that you were faced with. And Andrew had this. He was. in that sense, giving that reflection, this guru-like, teacher-like reflection,
Hmm.
it wasn't necessarily so conscious. I think at times it was conscious, and he was really working things through and trying to really make something happen in, as he might say it, or and other times I think he was just intuitively kind of feeling where someone's at. I think he did have this ability to really know something, about what it would mean for you to kind of like, embrace more of your own humanity or whatever it would be.
Yeah, yeah.
And I like to
Whatever
think,
your edge was, exactly.
yeah, and I really felt that, and particularly seeing him in, was it 2 months ago? Was it two?
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, I really
yeah.
felt that that was more true than other times. I really felt that he embraced more and more that that is the, you know, yeah, the delicacy of it all. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one thing is what you pointed out is that he could see very clearly where our edge was and pointed it out patiently for a long time. And I always felt like he got impatient when he felt like this is now a conscious uh, not accepting of one's edge and not an unconscious anymore, because he pointed out a lot of unconscious stuff to us, yeah. And as long as he felt like, okay, he or she just hasn't seen it, he just hasn't seen it, I have to point it out again and again. But then sometimes there was this point where he felt like, no, no, now she actually knows. I mean, that was true for myself. And now it's active resistance. And that's how I saw where he lost patience.
Well, I mean, sometimes rightly and wrongly. I mean, this is where I feel like there was I think he was to some, I mean, he was very intuitively connected to some kind of knowing. I know that for sure. And whether he caught, and I think he had later admitted, there's sometimes he got it right, sometimes he got it mostly right, and sometimes he got it
He did,
profoundly
yeah,
wrong,
in his
right?
book. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
and that was
exactly.
his own humanity at work there. But I think I think that was one of the because I never really I didn't really resist consciously in the way that I think about it. If I look back, we're looking back now and like thinking of those moments, and he never, for me personally, I don't really think he kind of like really ever pinned, he pointed out generic things about culture and,
Hmm.
and men and all the rest of it and women or whatever those things were. And I think there was some truth to a lot of that. And I think,
Hmm.
but this is just probably just my own kind of rumination on it. I think that even he didn't know quite quite a lot more of the time than it appeared to him, because I spoke to him years later and said, what about this thing, Andrew? What was going on there? And he'd go, I don't know, and and I think he actually meant it. There was moments where he was, you know, tuned into something where he didn't have the answer, but he felt there was a direction. And I felt that he always responded to a directionality or a deepening or whatever it will call. I don't think sometimes it was that, but that was, I think, also his nature was this,
Hmm. Hmm.
just to keep on turning over that stone, to really get go. And and I don't think it was necessarily just all about evolution, as he would call it, or would call it now, or
Mm.
development. I
No,
think
no.
it's just this. There's some nature to always inquiring, where but that would take an embodied thing of, because we're all part of the, as we, those early days, we'd say we're all part of this big experiment. So that was the
Hmm.
big caveat,
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like, it could go wrong, and you know, so you were aware that there was that living kind of inquiry going on, and you were a subject of that, right? And he was part of the inquirer at times, and other times it was our brothers and sisters, and other times it was yourself. But
Yeah,
he
yeah.
created, I think what I want to say, he really created this, because we're talking about the impact of him as a teacher, and and there's a big story to be told here, but part of it is definitely there was this living, breathing kind of inquiry going on, and some of it became too intensely focused maybe on our faults, for sure, at times. And then the big liberation came is when you realized actually you had to own your own inquiry, and it wasn't really about so much the collective. And then that would impact the collective. So there was very, you know, there were moments where, I think, the changing of how Andrew's community functioned were quite, there were like maybe four, I don't know how you'd see it, but three or four, at least four phases, right?
Yeah, I probably can talk about the last two, like the phase right before the crash, the years when I was there already, and then I can say a lot about the last phase, obviously, where a lot happened in Andrew and his own development. And you talked a lot about his teaching of seeing clearly, and something that really changed in him, I felt, over the last 10 years since he uh, came back and taught again, was that he was much more aware that seeing clearly is not possible anyway, not in this relative world, not in you can. He often said you can have an experience of perfection when you are connected to the absolute, but in the relative, in the manifest, you can never achieve perfection. And that was true for manifesting, but also for seeing clearly. Like his third tenet, face everything and avoid nothing, he was much more conscious that this is never gonna fully happen. We are not capable, not even with the help of the guru. The guru cannot see that clearly, the student cannot see that clearly. And I felt that was one of the biggest shifts, that he became much more, you could call it humble, but it was, I think it was a deep insight into the fact that it's just not possible that we can see clearly, but we can lean into seeing more and seeing
No,
more
that's
clear
right.
and
Yeah, I agree.
expand our understanding, no?
Well, that's why I always felt like when you were saying earlier about, he could see where your edge. I don't think that's why I was saying I don't think he did see that. I don't think he could see that. It was just this sense of things. And he responded very well to that intuition. And other times when it became when you crystallized into, oh, this is the thing that needs to change, I think that was, well, actually we're a process much more than a entity anyway. So how could it ever
Mm-hmm.
be a thing, right? So
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
so I think the beautiful thing around, and it was beautiful, was around Andrew was the community of people. And it wasn't just a sense of this fixed community around him. This was the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, maybe even despite his own, some of the way Andrew was, despite it, he was still pushing towards wanting this kind of sort of semi out of control unfolding of the community, I don't know if that's a good description, but a really living, breathing, Sangha of community. I think he really wanted that. And
Yeah,
obviously,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
but and I think to some degree we succeeded, and then other areas we really failed, and I think that was because of him. He catalyzed so much of that in so many people. And we would meet people that had, there was the manifestation in this magazine, and the magazine was, that was powerful because of the perspective.
Yeah,
And like if you read Sri Aurobindo's journals and stuff like that, there's some really cool stuff, but there wasn't a, it was doing, he was, there's a whole complexity around the magazine and everything, as you well know. But I mean, it had an effect, which was getting people to really think about the possibility
yeah.
that there's other ways of seeing and other perspectives. And it was very earnest and honest inquiry, right? So that was another catalyst that I think that was a contribution that is, it really will stand up. Um,
Totally.
and I can't really pin it down, but there's always this perspective that came out in that magazine context, which also a lot of us in the community, we try to kind of like emulate those ideals. So, you know, it really did create that kind of living.
Mm-hmm.
There was such a powerful sense of um, I don't even know its possibility, isn't it? Because I think excitement's one thing, but it was way beyond that. It was, it was sincere. There's a real sincerity with a lot of us, and
Yeah.
earnestly trying, right?
And also, wouldn't you also say it? what Andrew did or transmitted was something I always felt it as his transmission makes us want to live up to our ideals. That's probably the best way to say. Like that, like this sitting up straight, like this wanting to be our best selves. And that was supported by him in a mysterious way, and it was supported by the Sangha when you are a collective of people that live in that space where you want to you want to be your best self, whatever that means for each and every one of us. No.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's funny when I hear that, I don't it I understand what you mean and why you say that, but the way I put it was so for and it happened recently. It was just when we were there with you in India, and Andrew was giving these satsangs, so I thought I'd come along and sit with him,
Mm-hmm,
and it was very beautiful to have that because it is such a privilege to sit with someone like that. And whether, and I've sat with, many people over the last 10 years. We've,
mm-hmm,
traveled many places but when you have a personal connection and there's a self-recognition of a person and you and this,
mm-hmm.
but there is something that would happen when Andrew would walk in the room. I mean, it was kind of like, and it wasn't suddenly like you're saying something stood up. And I was reading, you know, Arini Twini's book actually, and she said when she met her teacher, who was a Sufi actually, a Hindu Sufi, so it all gets mixed up in India. But uh, she said that something in her stood up to attention, and she was
Mm,
she was, I think she came from the US, and she was she um she'd read a lot, and then but she said it was unmistakable when she met this her teacher who was to become a teacher. Something literally stood up in her, and I know, and I had that experience. So this is really interesting for me. All these years later, 30 years later, and I sat, and that thing happened, and
mm-hmm,
it's not about thought or thinking or having
mm,
some hierarchy in relationship to a teacher. This is just something that it's energetic on some level,
yeah,
but also there's just something in you that really recognizes something, and that's what
yeah,
stands up. So I
yeah,
felt Andrew did awaken that, very profoundly in many of us, and then we have to deal with that, like you're saying, the fact that we don't see all of, we can't, by nature of being incarnate, you can't, we're limited. So including him, right? That's the
totally.
big
Yeah, yeah,
learning. That's the big learning. But I
yeah,
was
yeah.
thinking
And
about,
he was very aware of that in the end.
well, yeah, I want to yeah, I'd love to talk more about that time as well. But I was just one other thing about Andrew, and because there was this great book by him, and he passed away recently, Alan Coombs, called The Radiance of Being.
Mm-hmm,
And in that, he'd talk about, and I think that all of that work, Alan Coombs' work was is quite profound, but um, he talked about attractors in consciousness. Um,
mm-hmm,
and I think Andrew definitely was one of those,
mm-hmm,
he definitely had this profound way of, yeah, despite himself. That's the funniest thing. I was sitting with him, and if you want to talk about that, but um, yeah,
yeah. He was a complex person, as
but
we probably all are, but he especially because so many things about him are true at the same time. You know.
yeah, I was just thinking about some things I was pondering over the last few days. It's gone a bit blank, but there was definitely this. Yeah, I because when I sat with him at the end, it was because I grew up and lived in London, so there was this times where we got this big center in America, and everyone was that's the place to be if you really wanted to do meaningful work, and Andrew obviously contributed to that, and it was super intense there, and in a beautiful way as well as in all the dimensions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you put a lot of people to live together in an extended period. It's like, you really see a lot of different things happen, right? And I mean, yeah. Um, how do I put it? So I didn't really go. I spent some time there. I did these extended retreats, like month-long retreats, but I always had this ability to kind of basically say, okay, Andrew, I've kind of done my bit. I think it's time to go.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
there was a lot of and yeah, this needs a whole lot of unpacking around the particular ideas of what it means to have a teacher, right? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then you have the converse, which is there are no teachers, there's friends. But I would often there's a certain moment where something was just needed. I maybe needed to go back, and I'd taken a sabbatical off from my work and said I needed to go. And I did this silent retreat in America for 5 weeks or something like that, or 6 weeks. I can't remember how long. And then there was like they emailed me out the blue, and I don't know how I got this email, but they said, I think you've got to come back because you need to work. You've got to come back and do your job. And I remember just writing to him and just saying, look, I think I need to go now because.
Mm.
And this was the interesting thing that there wasn't a breakthrough that was missing or hadn't happened or had
Yeah,
happened.
yeah,
And a lot of my time with Andrew, and I think this was the value that he really did put an emphasis on practice,
yeah,
in a committed way. And I think, and he really yeah, and that had a lot of impact on a lot of us, I feel. I know certainly for me, there was just something very beautiful about being allowed to, given permission to really commit yourself to something. And
yeah,
at times is because you needed to look into something. Other times it was just because it was good for you, um, to develop something, some kind of appreciation of your own body or whatever. So he did have these things. Like you and I talked when we were there, that there's probably a whole range of things we should have really developed as well, but there were other
yeah, yeah,
qualities. But yeah, so we did the best with what we got, right? But we definitely had some very profound. I remember being some of those retreats that we did together and that he really was leading. I think there was super. It wasn't in the end. It's not about the experience, but there was so much heart in all of that.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. In the end, it's not about the experience, and it is also about the experience because the powerful experiences actually are transformational. So it's one of these paradoxes that we want to hold very, very lightly in ourselves. No? We don't want to be experience hunting, but we also don't want to dismiss them because they are powerfully transformational. I think that's just what it is
Hmm.
in
So
spiritual physics.
yeah, I mean, you've spent a lot of time with him over these years, but I remember when I came and I spent time with you guys and everything, it was very moving because it was, and the first words Andrew and I said to each other, we sat down, was that, well, it feels like no time, and because it isn't,
Yeah,
there is no time in that dimension in relationship to if you have that kind of connection.
yeah,
Um, and I'm, we ended up talking about a lot of things, as you know, but one of the hallmarks of Andrew was, I mean, he'd be such a simple person at times as well. That was the reality. So we were sitting there, and then there's this decision about the car that they were going to get. They were getting that new. So we were
yeah,
basically bantering with him about whether we should get this color or this color, right? And it would
yeah, exactly.
and then we talked about cars, and I said, like, oh, I've lived in London, so I've always cycled. So I never had this need to drive a car, and it's a whole, and I was part of Greenpeace and all, so I was just like, I don't want to,
Yeah,
the contradictions of being in a system. But anyway, so then I, then had to learn to drive because I wanted to drive my mother and father around because they were getting elderly. So I went through the ordeal of getting a license, and you're getting one to, doing the driving there. And then Andrew was like, I learned to drive. Um, because he was very much looked after, and he didn't have everyone drove him everywhere. So then there's this big thing, that he had to learn to
yeah,
drive
yeah. When he still was in
independent.
America, it was a big deal.
So, and the thing is, having been through that when you're 50, right? He must have been older than 50 when he did that. It's actually really hard to learn to drive
No,
because,
55,
yeah, there you go.
56. Yeah,
And
yeah.
and I remember we were just sitting there just comparing it because we had the same experience of like, this is really hard, you know. And then he looked at me with that way he'd look at you, and he, you know, and there was just this certain humor in and Andrew, which was, you know, really full on at times for sure. And he goes, "Yeah, like we're really growing up now, aren't we?" And it was just this moment. I said, "Yeah, exactly," because you know it's a rite of passage in all over the world, right?
Yeah,
We're like
exactly.
we're at 50, whatever, and we're finally growing up. So, I mean, there was just moments like that which they were really special. And he
Yeah,
had so many people. That's the thing. He really did, and he, you know, that also was true. You know, in all of those relationships, I feel, you know, because. Um, yeah, so there was that whole side of him being an embodied someone that you could deeply, you know, there was this peace, a profound peace you felt if you were just with him that
yes.
and I got to experience that. And it wasn't even just peace, it was just this just ongoing kind of, you know, he used to call about talk about, oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about was Shivananda Ashram and Andrew, but that's a whole other thing because that was the other side of him. There was these moments where this was like back in the 90s where he
Hmm.
would sit, we would go up there to the Shivananda ashram, and there's Krishnananda there and Chidananda. And
Yeah,
Andrew sitting there basically, you know, in awe of these, you know, greats.
yeah.
And just to see that in your own teacher at times was it was quite humbling because you always knew that there was more, you know. And for me that had quite a big impact, being in those dialogues where it was a dialogue, but at the same time you could feel that kind of acknowledgement of
Yeah.
history and so on. And then fast forward to, you know, those sitting with him, I think because he encouraged me, he said, look, I've written this book about, you know, what I've been all my journey since you know, the sabbatical and, you know, the crash and everything. I think it'd be good if you read it. So you know, I hadn't really read a lot of these things just because I was trying to inquire in a very fresh way myself. But I did read it and we talked a lot about it, right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
I think the thing I really walked away with, and I think this is a contribution that Andrew has made through his life. It's, yeah, we something very powerful happened around him, the great arc, and then we try to create structures to hold something which can't really be held. And then that had cracks in it, partly and, you know, quite profoundly to do with Andrew's own, you know, things that he didn't see.
Hmm.
Then he, you know, really the fall from grace, but then him reckoning with that as any human being can, and then still having that connection to and desire for, you know, awakening and spirit and what that means in this life. I mean, and the big thing in that was the destruction of the perfect, the attainment of perfection.
Yes, exactly.
And I think in one way Andrew's contribution is going to be the fact that he could do that or did that in a really messy way or whatever he went through and whatever so many people went through. But then there was something that relaxed around that you could almost feel him dealing with his own, you know, all
Hmm.
of it. And you know, whatever, you know, that's between him and, you know, the cosmos. But at the same time, there is just something about he went through this process which was part of all of it. And that for me, that had quite an impact because, you know, in some ways, regard whatever you want to think, he actually is when you have a teacher or have that kind of relationship, you know, it affects, you know, or you get all of it, right? So then when over time that person recognizes their own limitation, that also has an impact.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
a teaching itself. So I've really felt personally, and you know, you know, it's very weird, you know, talking about mystical things. I happened to find my way to India at that time, and to be able to have that conversation, many conversations with you and many people about this, and even with him. And we'd have many of these conversations over the years. So this was also
Hmm.
the other side of. with Andrew. I mean, he obviously had, there's a whole structure around Andrew, but also he was very approachable. If you if you were willing to kind of like have, hold your own ground and really get into something with him. He was always, I remember one time this was towards the end of the thing. We were in London and we were saying, Andrew, we need to get rid of this building and center, right? And we really
Hmm.
need to do it. And we know you love it, but actually we really got to get rid of it because it's a real chain around our necks and we're interested in
Hmm. Hmm.
actually doing something different. And he really didn't get it. And he was like, really. And there was a couple of us just sitting there, and we weren't really bothered whether he'd understand our point of view, but because we were really into what we were saying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And then he just suddenly went, "Oh, I get it," and it was genuine. It was these moments of,
yeah.
and it was just really fascinating. So I had many of those with him as well. Just doing things which weren't part of the, and he was there for that. So
Hmm.
life is complex, but I really felt that the whole thing. So I wanted to do justice to that. That I felt that is also
Yeah, yeah.
the his
No,
legacy.
that's beautiful. And I want to come back to something you said about the book, and because I agree, I think he did something after the crash that was very unique. He went through a process that that opened up something for himself and potentially for all of us, and especially like the thing with the perfection. I find that very empowering for us when
Yeah.
the guru sees, oh, I'm not perfect. That means that a lot is possible without us thinking we have to perfect ourselves first before we can be liberated. So the liberation teaching changed into a liberation teaching that accepts imperfection as part of manifest reality, and still the liberation can be fully experienced and fully lived
Mm. Yeah,
in
yeah.
a way. And what I wanted to add to what you said about the book is that's why, because I really think it's an important book, or not the book is important, but the findings are important, and what Andrew did in these 2 years in his sabbatical. And it was very disappointing for him that literally nobody read it. And the few people who read it tore it apart and told everybody else who hadn't read it that it's not a good book, and Andrew hasn't seen anything and hasn't done anything. And
Uh-huh.
the fact that nobody gave him any credit for the process he went through, even so he was scrutinizing himself. Did he see everything? Did he see 100% in the end? No, probably not. But do we? But the process he went through was a serious process of grappling with what went wrong, what he did wrong. And he got to the bottom of it, of clearly seeing what he did wrong. But also, and I also always felt like many people didn't like that. He did not only see what he did wrong, he also still saw very clearly what went right in the community, what he did right, what was happening in the community. And he tried to hold it both in him. That's also why he wanted to teach again. He wanted the learnings to go into the next incarnation of his teaching
Uh,
and him as a teacher. And to see that many people, really, really many people, didn't allow him to have these insights and step out of the sabbatical into a new incarnation where things could be different, and they were actually different. That was a big disappointment for him, but also for all of us around him.
yeah, I mean, like you're saying, the book was there's many ways in which you could disagree and think it's, and there's a lot to be said about some of that book, but I just read it as a bit like looking this review of all of our life, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
you take any moment or instant and then devoid of context, then you can always say this would be better and all the rest of it, right? And I mean that is one of the things he did have, and it was a lot about context for Andrew, and that was a lot of the teaching actually was all about context, right?
Yeah.
And and I think that was I mean, one of the last conversations I had with Andrew was all about this, was not necessarily people not reading the books and all of that. I mean, I think people went through all sorts of many processes. So I mean,
Mm,
and some people feel like they've come to terms, all sorts. I don't really know, but I know that um, I didn't really feel the need to necessarily. I also felt that Andrew was he was there was something going on, but at the end he did say we had this very towards almost the last words I spoke to him about were, he said, look, I really feel that there's a wound you know in the community and around me, and that I need to heal. And it was just one of those things that. And we both were looking at each other in this very way in which even if it takes lifetimes. And I think he
mm,
really was wanted that. And I don't think it was just about him wanting, at least in that moment, it wasn't about doing something else. It was because that would be a reflection of trying to um, adhere to the whatever the Dharma was. It's like you try and understand the living truth of the matter, and that was a really poignant moment because he, and we kind of made this agreement, because I think a lot of people, this is the strange thing about this, the depth of the enlightenment and the shared togetherness is also held as part of the way that things, were, broke up. So
yeah.
it's all in that. And I agree. I did feel there was, Andrew was Andrew, and this was the thing. He was this New York Jew that was just kind of had the life, very nice life, and um, and then he, pursued the spiritual path, and he really was, a New York Jew, very intense as well, right? It's not everyone's cup of tea, right? And so I don't know
Yeah,
why I said that, but there was something
yeah,
about
he was. I
whereas
can tell you when a New York Jew with that intensity meets a Swiss
yeah,
woman and
right,
works together with her, that created a lot of interesting sparks
dynamics,
of
right? Yeah, and
tension and
yeah, and some
and beautiful coherence also.
yeah. So you're talking about an East End, Indo-Pakistani guy that has no.
Exactly.
What's the crossover there? Apart from Brick Lane, where the Jewish, community lived and then was taken over by, you know, but and yet there is this profound sharing of something
Mm.
very deep,
Yeah.
and that's possible. And that it's all there. It's all in those moments of just and we'd sit together at the end there, and there's these moments where he would kind of like you just fall into this very deep meditation, and then
Mm.
he'd be like, okay, then talk about something else. But it kept happening. It kept this
Yeah.
fall kept happening, and I remember, you know, a lot of layers just would disappear, and
Mm.
this is the kind of also thing that like I was saying earlier, it wasn't just about transmission, it was a perspective about there's more going on here than
Mm.
so
Yeah.
much what we're concerned with, and I think he was just always aware of that.
Yeah, he was, and if you wanted to, if you allowed yourself, you could fall into that space with him, and that was the most beautiful place to be, to be in this space with him and engage with him from that place. That's also what you described earlier as the timeless dimension that eradicates everything else that is on the surface and everything else that probably the small self would want to discuss or tear apart, but that there was a level of connection that is timeless and that is still here now. I mean, it's not gone anywhere. It's
Yeah,
still
yeah,
it's
yeah,
still available,
yeah.
and that's so beautiful. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanted to bring in addition to what we already covered? Because
a bit all over the place. But I don't know. I
Yes,
just really wanted
exactly.
the kind of arc of it all because when I was probably about 22, there was this woman called Caroline. I'll mention her, but she was this. I can't remember. Maybe she was Austrian or something, but she was quite old
Mm,
even then. And then and she was supposedly psychic. So she looked. We used to have some quite fun debates, and I think she
yeah.
was quite fond of me. So we used to, she's quite character, let's put it that way. And and we'd sit together after these meditations, and then she looked at me one day and says, Faheem, you're going to be there to the end.
Wow.
I was like, what are you talking about? And you know,
Yeah, and then you were here a month, 2 months ago.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow, what a story.
I mean, it's still unfolding. That's the thing. I feel
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to acknowledge that the catalytic kind of impact he had on myself for sure. And yeah,
Mm. And on many people. That's
yeah.
something that puzzled me always too. How many people we meet and met that haven't not even been students of Andrews that just
Oh, well, I
say,
won't really say the name, but we were at the World Parliament of Religions. I can't remember, it was 96 or 7 or whatever it was.
hmm hmm
And we had the magazine and we were handing it out. There's Deepak Chopra's there and all these characters,
hmm
it was a beautiful experience. But then there was this very famous singer, which I won't say who it is, but she was like, we saw her and we're like, oh my God, it's da 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 da. And then we went up to her and saw the magazine and her assistant's next to her and she says, we said, can we give you this magazine? She goes, oh my God, this is my favorite magazine.
oh wow,
And took it from us and told her assistant, like, make sure this is on my table.
uh,
And then she looked at us both and we were all in awe because it was like, um, it's just a beautiful person. And then
yeah.
she goes, well, you guys are, and I think she had some kind of Buddhist practice. She goes, you guys are really living something, aren't you? And we were like, yeah, but you're you. And we were having this kind of, I don't
Oh
think I'd ever
yeah,
told him that, but it was actually very cool. Moments like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing. Shall we leave it with that?
Let's go with that.
Thank you so much.